All right, let's talk about grouping criteria as another error in scientific inference. So when we try to group people together, we can group them on, for example, beliefs, right? So we might group them based on their religious beliefs, or we might group them based on their political beliefs, or something else. Or we might group them together based on their customs. So like, what do they eat, or how do they dress, or what kind of music do they listen to? Or we might group people together based on physical characteristics. So we might group people together based on skin color or facial features or other factors that are physical. When we group people based on one, or maybe a couple, maybe one belief, one custom, and one physical characteristic, we group them into one group based on sharing those or something like that. We can end up drawing incorrect inferences because our grouping criteria was faulty. Because it's so easy to notice physical characteristics, that has been a really common grouping criterion, where we put people together based on skin color, we put people together based on hair texture or color, or eye color or shape, or these kinds of physical characteristics, height or sex, or other kinds of things. It's so easy to assess people just at a glance when we're doing physical characteristics that we don't have to look any deeper to figure out if there's something more important that differentiates these people. When we look at beliefs, we find, first off, it's a lot more complicated to assess their beliefs, for one thing, to figure out what their religious perspective is. I mean, you could ask them, what religion do they perceive themselves to be, if any, or you can ask them a whole bunch of questions to determine to what degree are they religious. We call that a measure of religiosity. Or, if I was just talking to one of my students who I'm doing some research with, and the question that she wants to ask does have a stereotypical association with political beliefs. And so we're kind of trying to figure out how are we going to ask about political beliefs without really sort of leading the participants to know exactly what we're trying to do with this. And so we were trying to think of, how do you ask? Do you just ask, what group are you registered to vote with? Because some people won't be registered to vote. Do you ask them who they more closely align with? Do you give them some examples of platform statements to see if they agree or disagree with those platform statements? Like, how exactly do you assess political opinions or political beliefs? So it's much more complicated to measure beliefs, but new research has found that there's actually genes that are associated with political conservatism or liberalism. Other genes that are associated with religiosity. It looks like the gene basically says if you have one variant of it, you're more likely to be a religious person. It doesn't say what religion, it just says you're more likely to be a religious person, and if you have a different variant of it, then you're more likely to be agnostic or atheist. It's not perfect, but it's associated. So it looks like beliefs might even have a biological underpinning to it. But because it's so hard to measure, it's not as common of a grouping criterion as something as shallow as physical characteristics often are. And you can imagine that beliefs, either you inherited the tendency to hold certain kinds of beliefs, or you were surrounded by other people who shared those beliefs, and really you engaged in a lot of cultural kinds of behaviors that are tied to the beliefs that you have. And those probably have impacts on personality developing, right? Let's talk about customs a little bit more, because this one's kind of in between. I mean, we could probably pretty much at a glance determine like the food styles or the clothing styles or the music styles. It's a little bit kind of like at a glance, but let's talk about this a little bit more. How about one aspect of these customs? Socioeconomic status. People who come from higher socioeconomic status have a lower risk of disease and a lower risk of premature death. So there's already something going on that might have an impact on personality, right? That you have a higher likelihood of making it into adulthood. You have a lower risk of experiencing chronic disease at a young age, or deadly disease. There aren't really great studies documenting an association between socioeconomic status and personality. There's not a lot to show that, having been raised in, upper income, middle income, lower income, that really seems to have reliable effects on at least traits like conscientiousness or agreeableness or openness to experience and so on. Language, we keep coming back to this. It's probably a defining feature of a person's identity. Like I said, we oftentimes don't think about that. We don't think about how important language is to our sense of self, to our sense of agency. I mean, I might have already mentioned this in a previous lecture, so I'm sorry if I'm in reruns. But for example, in English, if I drop a glass, I say, I dropped a glass. In Spanish, if you want to say the same exact thing, the structure of the language is different, so that what you actually say is the glass was dropped, which is different, right? Like, I dropped the glass is much more like agent, right? Like, I did that. The glass was dropped is much more passive, right? I don't know, it's broken, the glass fell, right? So it's a defining feature of our personality and sort of how we attribute outcomes. It affects how we think about and understand the world. So, for example, when we talk about something as simple as colors, like the colors that you're looking at on the screen right now are shades of blues and greens, right? There are cultures in the world that don't have different words for blue and for green. They use the same words to describe things that are blue and things that are green. So imagine what that might do to the person's perception of an ocean that comes up to a green grassy knoll, and so we've got the blue water, we've got the green grass. Like, are you seeing it and understanding it exactly the same way that a person who has the words blue and the words green? Or even better, different shades of blue and different shades of green. Like, I've got on the PowerPoint on the left, we've got sky blue on the bottom, and we've got what shade of blue would that maybe the top one's sky blue and the bottom was turquoise. I don't know. And then on the one on the right, we've got like sage green on the top and forest green on the bottom. I don't know. I mean, even with lots of things I could choose, we could probably bicker about exactly what shade of green these are, because we have different words for all of it, different at least adjectives to describe these shades of green and these shades of blue. Just something superficial like that, like color, you can imagine how it could impact the way that you look at the world and think about the world. Pronouns influence how we see the world, how we view our own capability, how we view our own roles within the world. And so, when we have pronouns like they, she, he, these things, they invoke an image in the listener's mind, and they project their own sort of stereotypes onto it, their own expectations for a person who has that pronoun. And then as the person who's being described, we know about the stereotypes and things like that also, and it causes a reaction, and it causes us to see the world differently and react to people differently and things like that. So here we have, by age, the use of first-person pronouns. And this came from, sorry, my dog's barking. This comes from Facebook, so you can kind of judge this validity however you want. So what we see is, as people age, both males and females, the females are in the F's and the males are the M's, both males and females use first-person singular pronouns less and less as they age. Now, not, it doesn't drop off a cliff, but, you see a trending downward of the lines. And so we use less and less of the first person pronouns as we get older, in part because we recognize that they invoke stereotypes, and then also because they are imprecise. When you refer to she, you could be talking about a lot of different people, whereas if you say Mary, we know we're talking about, the narrow band of people that we both know who are named Mary, right? So first person pronouns may decline with age, in part because of, just specificity of communication. So this is first person plural pronoun. So this is they and we, us. And they, until probably 5 years ago, was always considered a plural word. So it is generally plural for a group of people of unknown sex. Us and we, plural. And so what you see is as people age, this is probably a little more dramatic line going up. People use more and more of those plural first-person pronouns. So it's a little bit more inclusive as we get older. Here is the use of gender pronouns by sex. And on the left, we have female writers who are writing in the third person, and then how often they use masculine and feminine pronouns. On the right, we have female writers writing in the third person, how often they use masculine and feminine pronouns. And what you notice is that male writers use a lot more of the masculine pronouns. That's the blue solid line. Female writers tend to use equal numbers of male and female pronouns. So kind of interesting differences by sex. Well, back to what we were talking about. And then finally, under language, I have bilingualism. Each language is actually a different context for our behavior. So whatever language we are speaking or that it's being spoken to us serves as part of the context for determining how we'll act. So I'm going to take a pause here, and what you're going to find is a series of 2 TED Talks. This first one is on how language shapes the way we think. The second one is on how language might affect your tendency to save money. And his description of the words we use for saving money is really an interesting one. And then this last one is a YouTube video on bilingual language and context. So I'll go ahead and have those load up, and then I'll see you back here on the other side.